Yeah, so thank you so much for the friendly introduction and the invitation. Very happy to be here and very happy to have that you organize that conference. It's really a great thing that now Muslims are all the main speakers of that conference. I'm the only guest who is not from the Muslim side who tries to contribute something, and scholars from other religions give the responses, or other scholars, but it's, I think, a new development in the international fields, in the still emerging field of comparative theology, that Muslims try to define their relationship to it and develop it. I'm very honored to be here and very curious to what happens today, and especially tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. So you asked me to give a talk on the history of comparative theology on Muslim-Christian relations. But when I tried to look at this, I saw that this is quite difficult to do in a way that it makes sense for this conference. So if we understand comparative theology in a very wide way, there are so many things to say in Muslim-Christian relations that I would just look at the very long history and look, for example, at the early Abbasid era, like Najib Awad, who reminds us that there's not only Jewish Mu'tazilism, but also a Christian Mu'tazilite theology. And we would have to think about this kind of rationalist approach, how Greek philosophy is used here, and we could continue in doing the very same thing then for 11th and 12th century and looking at Aquinas, Ibn Sina and Maimonides, as David Burrell has done. And if we go through the whole history like this, Al-Andalus will be a big subject for us this spring. So there are so many things to say which have already been said by scholars who know that better than me, that I would waste all our time with things that you can read better in books, and it wouldn't really help to define comparative theology. If I take a narrow approach and just look at comparative theology in a stricter sense, even then I would have to start quite early. And in the beginning I wanted to do that and show you like how Louis Massignon and Louis Gardet and Georges Anavati do that, use the term théologie comparée, because I learned that from Sidney Griffith and thought that nobody knows it, but Pim wrote a wonderful article on that in the companion to comparative theology, so you can read it also there. It would, so I just refer to that. He shows how the interiorist method of Louis Massignon to understand Islam from within, and how he uses the mysticism of Al-Hallaj for his return to Catholic faith. This is really not only comparative theology avant la lettre, but it's already called comparative theology, at least then by Georges Anavati and Louis Gardet, who wanted to have their series of théologie comparée, and who tried to bring different systems of theology together, like Kalam and scholastic Christian Thomistic theology. So I won't tell you more on that, because I thought this has already been done, and it's you can read it better. So what I tried to do and how I changed my subject now is that I tried to think, okay, if you want to define Islamic comparative theology in the conference, so I should maybe try to bring to the floor what has been done by Muslims already within the field of comparative theology. So what I will do is I borrow the title how Frank Clooney started to introduce comparative theology in the States. He wrote a wonderful article in 1995, The Emerging Field of Comparative Theology, a bibliographical review. And at that moment, not many people were talking of that, but he decided somehow to select some people who do comparative theology and call it comparative theology. So I will try to look at this emerging field now in looking what Muslims are contributing, some using the term comparative theology, Some others not using it so much, but still working obviously in that field. And I will restrict myself just to these last decades, so to the time of the new comparative theology, because otherwise it becomes too much. That's just a pragmatic reason. So I will do this in 5 steps. I will look at Islamic comparative theology in the context of theology of religions. I will then try to look how Muslims engage with biblical tradition in that framework, how they engage with Christian theology and with Christian philosophical traditions. And in the end, I will try to use Catherine Cornill's 6 forms of learning to make a kind of structure or order of what I tried to explain. Okay, so as some of you might know, there is already since some decades a debate within Islamic theology on an Islamic theology of religions. And of course, we have Muslim pluralists who try to use what John Hick has developed in the sense of a pluralist Muslim theology. Of course, others react and try to show that Muslim tradition is not so much pluralist, but more inclusivist. For example, Muhammad Hassan Khalil showed quite convincingly that very important scholars from Muslim tradition are somehow inclusivist in their approach. But Esra Dag in her dissertation made a very interesting observation that those who claim to be pluralist are in fact very inclusivist in some sense, and that it's a kind of typical Quranic inclusivism to be supersessionist in the end. So she shows that sometimes pluralists end up in being supersessionists because they use their Islamic background to appreciate something what is in fact very Islamic and not so much as pluralist as they claim that it is. So Dag shows that there are explicit supersessionist exclusivists like Sayyid Qutb, Qadi, Timothy Winter, and others. But what is more interesting is that such a supersessionism even happens sometimes among those who are pluralists and makes the field very complicated. So the big question is whether it's possible to develop an Islamic theology of religion which is not supersessionist, and supersessionism would be here understood as an abrogation of other religions who find their fulfillment in Islam and are only accepted in a deficient way. They are not that you cannot learn something really new from them because everything what is important is said in the Quran. And sometimes other religions might say something which is similar, then it's good. If it's something different, then it won't help. And if this is the case, then of course it becomes difficult to do comparative theology, because comparative theology always wants to teach differences and tries to learn from differences. That's the key idea of comparative theology. One way of trying to find a solution here might be a Sufi-based approach. Adnan Mokrani, who might join us in the internet, I cannot see that now, is a wonderful scholar who tries to develop that. But in those who develop full theologies of religion, Reza Shah Kazemi might be one of them who tries that. He accepts the religious otherness of non-Islamic religions as part of divine unity. He regards all revelations as expressions of one and the same religious essence. What distinguishes him from Hick and from the traditional pluralist account is that for him, religious diversity is divinely ordained. So it doesn't come from the perceptions of humans, but it's God's idea to have this pluralism. And of course, this works very well from a Sufi position. But in the end, as Esra Dag shows in a very convincing way, in the end, he sees all religions through his Sufi eyes. and the real differences of other faiths are ignored. Buddha, for example, never claimed to be either a prophet or to have been revealed by any ultimate power. So it doesn't help Buddhists if they are included in giving such attributes to Buddha. Hence, those who pretend to be pluralist, as Reza Shah Kazemi, become at least inclusivist and the very key challenge for comparative theology to appreciate differences doesn't become easier to such an approach. Those pluralists, as Radak makes clear, make generalizations about non-Islamic religions as if they had been constructed in the same way as historical Islam. And this is the reason why they fail to see those differences. It's interesting that Radak uses this as an argument for changing the Islamic reflections in the direction of comparative theology. She writes in her book, there is a need for more solid claims which are firmly supported by study and engagement with particular religion, so that we don't look at them just with our glasses, our prejudices, but we really look what is out there. From this point of view, she writes, for Islamic theology of religions, the tools of comparative theology would be useful as it requires a deep engagement with other traditions other than their own. So she explicitly mentions many times comparative theology here. I will argue, I still quote her, I will argue that Islamic theology of religions needs to engage at a deeper level with non-Islamic religions, teachings, and texts to offer a comprehensible theology which will do justice to the similarities and differences of diverse religions by utilizing comparative theology. So she has understood that comparative theology is a means not only to look at similarities, what Muslims always like to do in all their tradition when looking at other religions, but to look at differences and to see whether there is something to learn from that. It is the duty of Muslims, she writes, to engage with non-Islamic traditions themselves to achieve a better understanding. From the Islamic position, Muslims believe that what is given them is true, but this does not necessarily lead to a dismissal of the true elements of other religions, is her idea. So she invites Muslims to develop what Keith Ward, one of the most important early pioneers of comparative theology, what Keith Ward calls an open theology. So open to the difference of other religions and the possibility of changing or revising its position about the religious other on the basis of such engagement. Muslim and Christians, despite having differences, can still learn from each other. Theorizing other religions should take place after interreligious engagement, not before. So I brought some of the quotations to show how close this is to the typical program of comparative theology. Don't theologize before the encounter, do it after. It's not a theology for dialogue, but of dialogue. And try to learn from differences, try to look at differences. Don't try to harmonize everything away, but engage with particularities. That's her plea. Her background, by the way, is she did his PhD with a British Catholic exclusivist, whom we had also as guest in Paderborn. You might remember. He was in your garden, Muna. Who kind of has a lot of sympathies with comparative theology and learns a lot from differences, but is still a very conservative Catholic truth claim activist. So it's interesting that in that kind of discussion, a Muslim comparative theologian can grow and develop and make such pleas. And it's very much the same British environment with the same kind of Catholic theology in the background, which became inspiring for Muhammad Gamal Abdel Noor, who wrote also a comparative theological approach to the question of truth and salvation, and who tried to make a comparative history between Catholic and Ash'ari theologians. So Abdel Noor is an Ash'ari theologian who's coming from Al-Azhar University and has the pride of Al-Azhari scholars, and tries to bring that together with the Catholic tradition. In his book, for example, he says, I do not subscribe to the binary division between insider and outsider, nor do I see a clear-cut division between comparative theology and comparative religion. I think that's an interesting quote because from a German perspective, of course, confessional theology is more than insider perspective. What we do at universities wants to include the outsider perspective. A theologian could never be a theologian at the university. The theologian simply takes the insider perspective. So theology in the German understanding is a negotiation between insider and outsider perspective. So of course, every German theologian would agree that there is no clear-cut division between comparative theology and comparative religion. That's clear. And that it's not only insider but also outsider. It's interesting that he is emphasizing that so much. It might be different in the English-speaking discussions. Also because we don't have theology as a discipline at public universities in the same sense as in Germany. So methodologically, he decides to focus on schools, not on individuals, because this will reveal the real impact of original and influential theologians. And he looks at the formative phase of both the religions, a certain moment in history, and at today, and up in Karl Rahner on the Catholic side. So, of course, this is huge, and also Christian theologians do that sometimes, try to give an overview of the whole history, but there's always the big danger if you give an overview, especially of another religious tradition, that you make mistakes. And of course, this also happens with Abdel Noor. For example, he writes, Catholic theologians, although attempting to find solutions to the questions of the virtuous pagan, never separated soteriology from epistemology, i.e. grace and reward come only through Jesus Christ. Well, in Catholic theology in Germany, there are very important examples of scholars who make exactly that differentiation, that they say on the soteriological level we can be pluralist, everybody can go to God, but epistemologically, from the epistemological, of course we have to be exclusivist, because anything else will end up in relativism, like Peter Knauer, Armin Kreiner, and others are arguing like that and still think that they are Catholics at least. It's interesting that those in Britain, like Gavin da Costa, this is the guy from the Garden of Muna. So Gavin da Costa and other very Vatican-observing Catholics who like to look, especially in their theology, at everything what the Pope is saying, they wouldn't like that kind of Catholic theology. So they might teach that this is not Catholic anymore. But in a German perspective, that is a big part of our discussion to differentiate here epistemology and soteriology. So if you want to look at Catholic tradition and claim to do that, you shouldn't say this is not part. So also the next move to say that in Ash'ari thinking, as in Catholic thinking, there's always only this epistemic inclusivity or exclusivity, but of course never pluralism, is also a kind of apologetic move of conservative Catholics, who would say because the pluralists tell their master narration is, we had exclusivism in the beginning, then inclusivism, and today, if you're modern, you have to become a pluralist. So the reaction of conservative Catholics is to say, well, even in the beginning, we had inclusivist thinking. Through all history, we have exclusivist and inclusivist at the same time. And only today, some heretical people claim that you can become a pluralist. And of course, you can argue like this in the Nouvelle Theologie, in the Catholic tradition. This has been done in a very sophisticated and good way. It's not nonsense to argue like that. But if you make a comparative study on Catholicism, you should see what you're doing if you buy such an apologetic move. You can buy it, but you should know that you buy something. And it might be that something else is true for Ash'ari tradition, which is in his theology always defined by Al-Azhar, who knows best what Ash'ari theology is. So maybe it's wise that sometimes also Muslim comparative theologians look at certain persons and not at whole schools. I just mentioned Mojtaba Beidagi's PhD, who just looked at Motahari and Rana with a very similar question, but not claiming to look at the whole tradition. But of course, it's very inspiring to read Abdel Noor's book, and it's a wonderful overview of so many things that I can only recommend you to look at this. And he loves comparative theology and mentions it many times in a positive way. But my impression is that as Esra Dark, she is more in the camp of an open access exclusivism in what he understands as comparative theology. So he thinks that salvation is also central for Muslims, but that the last decision on their salvation is for God, so we cannot know. And that's exactly how Gavin da Costa and others who, or even Karl Barth, would argue in open access exclusivism. Consequently, Al-Azhar issued a manifesto declaring that Muslims are not in the position to declare non-Muslims as kuffar, and otherwise this is left to God. By implication, Muslims' primary message to Christians lies more in the concept of witness than in the concept of missionary, which of course is a very helpful consequence from a Christian point of view. But the question is whether this can be really the result of a comparative theological study in the sense as he tries to present it. So I could add some other speakers like Muhammad Legenhausen, who is often a guest in Paderborn and who seems to have a kind of post-liberal particularism in the Islamic tradition, and combining this with a very strong approach of classical theism, but it would become, I think, too much if I engage such senior scholars in a very short moment, and he doesn't pretend to do comparative theology in his books, so I leave him aside, although I think I could be used as a comparative theologian. The last person I want to introduce in that debate as somebody who was invited and will also speak. And she's on and wonderful. So I don't want to say too much on the feminist part of it, because this seems to be Yerusa's own part, and I don't want to take away her points. But I just wanted to say how much I'm fascinated by her approach to theology of religions and how she uses then comparative theology here. So her distinction between lateral and hierarchical differences seems especially intriguing to me. She makes clear that there are hierarchical differences in the Quran. There is something also in other religions which is not appreciated, which is highly problematic. But there is a possibility of seeing differences from other religions which are simply in a lateral way on the other side and not better or worse. So in a certain Quranic passage, I quote here, lateral difference is an ayah, a sign of God. It is something designed to cause awe and provoke reflection, thus leading to recognition and glorification of God. God is encouraging interaction across the boundaries of lateral difference. Second, a reflective and engaged encounter with the lateral other reveals something about God. So for me, this was very fascinating to have that idea of lateral differences. I haven't heard it before, so that without that hierarchical differences, and that the Quran offers ayat, offers signs to understand that, and that I get deeper knowledge of that if I look at the other religious traditions. She also uses the concept of taqwa here as a core message of all religions. What makes people not religion superior is this taqwa, which might be translated as piety or devotion to God, even as fear of God. What is interesting in this approach for me are those lateral particularities that she engages. The obedience to a messenger, for example, is connected to those lateral religious particularities, which means that for Muslims it might be important to be obedient to Muhammad, but that Christians might have to be obedient to another messenger. The discourse indicates that it is possible for individuals to fully manifest taqwa without following the lateral particularities revealed in the revelation of Muhammad, to Muhammad, which means that here is no supersessionism anymore. The central Quranic concepts, including Imam, Kufr, Islam, Shirk, fall within the semantic field of taqwa rather than ummah, which also very obviously leads in that direction, that beliefs and theological categories of other religious traditions can be respected and translated to something what is more general than a specific Islamic belief. So when Esra Dag summarizes what Jerusha Tanner Rhodes has written, she says this is just wonderful, but it's what is lacking is the comparative perspective. It's still only theology of religions. And 1 year later, Jerusha Tanner Rhodes wrote her Islamic feminist comparative theology. Of course, not a response to her, but response to that concern. And here she makes clear that she's following Clooney and Fredericks when she understands comparative theology as a theological practice that derives constructive impulses for its own theological thinking from the theologies of other religions. What was most inspiring for Muna and me when we wrote the book on Mary and the Quran was how in one chapter she understood Mary as role model for Muhammad, and how she included then Christian feminist ideas like Marcella Althaus-Ried and their ideas of Mary as queer of heaven to develop her ideas. This is a very conscious comparative theology, learning from another religious tradition and helping to stress something in your own tradition in the sense of a recovery of that tradition, which is done very, very convincingly in her approach. So my impression is that she is not simply delivering a new version of pluralist theology of religion, but that she tries to develop her theological reflections in that direction of comparative theology. And I'm very curious to what she will say to us on Sunday. I would like to use those categories that she outlined a little bit to discuss with you whether this is inclusivist or not in some sense, what she's doing here when she uses Quranic concepts like taqwa and others to appreciate differences, because you could also, as Ezra Dark in the end, say, well, that's also just inclusivism, and in the end it becomes supersessionist. So how can we develop this more, and looking for a Quranic theology of religions which becomes a comparative is my question. Is it enough to look curiously at other religions as Ezra Dark, who in the end of her book gives some examples how comparative theology could be done, but it's more curiosity what you can learn from this chapter, and it's not anything really thought through. So is it enough to say, let's see what will happen? Or is it legitimate to look at the lateral differences in Judaism and Christianity without supersessionism as tenor roads? Or does this lead to pluralism in a sense which might be problematic because it might become relativistic? When asking those questions, I have to admit that I am inclined through the PhD of Wahid Mafdavi-Meir to think that it might be possible to develop a Quranic point of view which tries to defend not only a comparative but even ecumenical approach towards Abrahamic religions from an Islamic point of view. So, because I read Wahid's work, and I'm very much looking forward to his presentation tomorrow, I would even ask, is a Quranic inclusive hermeneutics able to teach differences? My impression from his work, I didn't believe that in the beginning, but after some years of discussion with him, my impression is that this is really possible, that the Quran tries to teach us differences here. And even include high Christology and Israel theology. But of course, this is a huge subject, and I just want to indicate that there are some voices within the emerging field of comparative theology today, Islamic comparative theology today, who try to develop in a way which avoids exclusivism, supersessionism, inclusivism, and who do not want to become pluralist and offer something which teaches and appreciates differences. And I'm very curious whether this really works, and I'm sure that we will hear a lot on that tomorrow. So this was the longest part, the first part, because here it's the easiest. It was kind of easy because all the authors I was looking at also pretends to be comparative theologians and develop it. So if we look now in the other areas, it becomes a bit more difficult, and I might choose not the right persons. Maybe there are others who would better be quoted. So always, if you know other Muslims who make important contributions to the field, which are not mentioned by me, please tell me, just email me. Then for the article, I can try to include all of them, because it wants to give a kind of overview. So deep engagement with the biblical tradition, at that moment it's the question whether an engagement with biblical tradition is already comparative theology, because if you do historical, critical, Quranic exegesis, it's completely impossible not to engage the biblical tradition. And even traditional tafsir sometimes knows that. So that's why when I read that 8th chapter of the Companion to Comparative Theology, which is a wonderful book, but there, with that chapter, I was not so convinced that what Nadine Al-Sulaimi and Maria Braga are doing is really comparative theology. So they show us some exegetical facts on the Bible and the Quran, including some of the commentary tradition. Their comparison shows similarities and differences. But what I was missing is any surprise or learning. So if it's, as the text says, through the centuries, Muslims have realized that they cannot understand the narrative without reading the Bible, so the narrative of Job. Well, that's something we knew already without the help of comparative theology. And I was a bit looking, okay, what exactly is the new insight, what I get from this text, what not a religious study, scholars could say. And also when I looked at Yunus Mirza, I had kind of the same problem. So John Kaltner, even Muna used him in his, so she seems to like that kind of theology. But when I look at their common book, bringing Bible and the Quran together, of course you can learn a lot of things, but also here I'm not so sure that this is so particularly that's stressing differences and learning from them in both directions. I don't say these are not wonderful contributions, but I'm wondering whether this is already comparative theology. If yes, then it's difficult to do Muslim exegesis without being a comparative theologian. I also looked at this wonderful volume where Ali also contributed, also on reading the Bible in Islamic context. And well, so Shirin Shafai shows how subtle narrative differences in the Bible and the Quran have led to major differences in the conceptualizations of central theological categories in the biblical and Quranic traditions. She tries to read the other scriptures in its own terms. That's all interesting and wonderful, but still, I thought this is the first step, but the comparative theological part would be to use that for conclusions, to show how to learn from it for your own theological tradition. Maybe this happens a bit in the text from Ali Maghlabi and Larry Ciccarelli, who trace back the different Sunni and Shiite readings of David. But in the end, it mentions only some implications for Muslim and Christian readers, and that show how the Bible challenges the doctrine of Isma, but it's not used to change this doctrine of inerrancy. So this dogma of Isma. It would be interesting now to see, okay, if you take for granted that in the Bible David is not without sin and not perfect, and you think this is important and meaningful for the Quran, and the Quran even alludes to it, okay, what does this mean for your concept of inerrancy of the prophet? That would be interesting to get to know. That would be comparative theology. But I don't see that in that article, which is not a criticism of it. The book doesn't pretend to be comparative theology. So I'm just saying there are a lot of wonderful books out there doing also wonderful historical critical exegesis, but still I don't feel inclined to include that in a literary review of comparative theology. That might be different with, of course it's different with Shabir Akhtar. His book on the New Testament in Muslim eyes is a commentary from a Muslim on a Christian book of the Bible, the letter to the Galatians. That's quite exciting. And it's a very important method within comparative theology to do that. There is a whole series from Catherine Cornell on Christian commentaries of non-Christian texts. And Pim Falkenberg has also contributed to that series. So that's what Christian comparative theologians do. And it's exciting that now this is even meant as a series, as a starting of a series, if I understood it well, at least, that a Muslim is doing that here. So he's writing a commentary, a tafsir, he calls it also a tafsir. Just as Ibn Rushd comments Aristotle, he thinks that he can comment a biblical book. I think it's very wise that he says no sincerely written commentary can be wholly hostile. Otherwise, you wouldn't engage in that details and work for some years on those verses. Writing commentaries is the most difficult part. One of my colleagues in Old Testament in Bonn, he has just written now 20 years of his life. He did nothing else than writing a commentary of the prophet Isaiah. We had a big celebration that it's finished now, but this is how you comment holy text. That's your life then. And doing that, spending that for another religious tradition, that's a big thing. I think Pim could tell us a lot on that. He took also many years in writing this commentary. So the commentary in itself is already an act of comparative theology, but of course still, if you read the book, there are some questions I have. He postpones judgment long enough to treat the rival seriously, but in the end you often see how he struggles with his rival, which is obviously Paul, and he's not so much willing really to learn and to develop his own theology, which would be even more fascinating to show that. Another book which I would include in that idea of comparative theology is Munim's series book on scriptural polemics. She shows that Muslim reformers and how they have critically engaged with classical sources and modern contexts. So when we dealt with classical tafsir literature, we always had the idea that doesn't change so much through history. So it's enough to take some classical examples. But Siri tries to show that this is not true for modern tafsirs, that they really change something. So this is not a comparative aim. But what she is doing then is to show that those reformers learned to a certain extent from Christian and Western tradition, which leads them to contest the theology of exclusivist salvation, the theory of falsification of Jewish and Christian scriptures, and things like this, which is even a rectification if we take the forms of learning of Catherine Cornell. That's the most difficult thing to get at the rectification, accepting a rectification of your own tradition. If you really think that the other religion can make you to see that something was wrong what you thought before, that's the highest degree of learning from a difference. So that happens here. So that's why I include her, although I think that's chapter 5 on the Christological parts is not particularly creative. Okay, and Paderborn, of course, what Zishan is doing is very much bringing historical critical exegesis to comparative theology, because there is a learning on the level of methodology, as you can see in his dissertation. But there is also a deep engagement with the Bible and patristic texts in Syriac tradition, looking at the Syriac original text and really using them to get a better understanding of the Quran, and not only using them in an apologetic sense. So, but also if I look at what Muna and me have done on Mary and the Quran, I would say it's a kind of Paderborn even school which is developing here. Zishan also helped so much in our exegetical reflections. So to develop an exegetical style which really tries to learn in the understanding of the Quran from comparison and dialogue. So you can be very proud of that here in Paderborn. Third chapter now, and the chapters become always shorter to keep the time. The engagement with Christian theology, which is more my field usually, as I'm a systematic theologian, not an exegete. So, first question here is also, is it already comparative theology if you borrow from another religious tradition? Then Muhammad Rashid would be the first to mention in comparative theology. So, for example, in his book on Islam is Mercy, he borrows from Christian tradition and says this explicitly. There's his idea of revelation as self-communication is inspired by Vatican II and modern Catholic theology. In the article which he wrote together with Ufuk Topkara in a journal which was later became a book on comparative theology, he also has some reflections on the question how his theology of mercy is shaped by comparative engagement and makes it explicit here. The reason why I'm a bit hesitant to call him a comparative theologian is that he often borrows without making that explicit. And this is in a comparative context quite problematic, because you should honor your dialogue partner in the way that you show where you learn from it, also where you disagree. But it's a bit problematic if you quote something what comes from somebody else, if you appropriate it without showing the appropriation. Like, for example, the title Gott sucht Mitliebende in his book is obviously from John Duns Scotus in the Christian tradition, and this is never mentioned in the book. And that makes it difficult to see it as a comparative theology. It might be wise to do that because he wants to shape a certain style of Islamic theology, and maybe sometimes it's better not to mention the Christian sources to convince Muslim colleagues and students. So I don't blame Muhammad for doing that. I just explain why I think that this wouldn't be the way how comparative theology should be done. Then there you always have to make clear when you borrow. So is such a borrowing already comparative? Also a question for Farid Esak. Muna has in a wonderful way shown how much Farid Esak is borrowing from Christian liberation theology, and sometimes he also mentions it himself. But for Esak, I think this is a different way of doing theology, because for him, it's much more important to have practical and political cooperation with non-Muslims for a good cause, what he learned in South Africa. And that might widen the notion of comparative theology if you call that comparative theology as well. I would like it to call it also comparative theology, but this is also a task when you define Islamic comparative theology. Is it already comparative if you work collaboratively? Felix Körner would be very happy. He doesn't like comparative theology at all and invites everybody to collaborate and do collaborative theology. I'm ready to call also collaborative theology comparative theology, but I wouldn't reduce comparative theology to collaborative theology, and that's the danger in Farid Esak. Another person we might mention is Naim Pourmohammadi from the Iranian context, who very creatively tries to engage Christian theologies and use them for her own kalam and her own thinking. In the problem of evil, she has used a lot of Christian theodicies to develop her own thinking of the problem of evil. And even in salvation, she tries to engage constructively the Christian's idea of salvation. I remember when I was in Iran and making all the observations at the Holy Shrine and seeing how close that is to Catholic beliefs, all Muslim theologians always told me, it seems to be close, but it's so different. You cannot imagine how different it is. And nothing happens like what you know from your martyrs. And if we do like this, that's not what you Catholics are doing. It's something completely different. Naime was the only one who kind of said, yes, well, you're right. There are important similarities. And let's work on that. Let's see what happens. So sometimes it's also important to admit as a comparative theologian that similarities are there. If in an apologetic atmosphere, people say that such similarities do not exist. So engaging Christian theologies, I could give a lot of examples of people who are doing that. So Martin, I don't know how to pronounce, Nguyen, very interesting. You brought him to my attention at Fairfield University. In his Modern Muslim Theology, he argues that theology is a creative process and discusses how the Islamic tradition can help contemporary practitioners negotiate their relationships with God, one another, and with the rest of creation. I don't read here the rest. It's simply, it shows that you can see from the book that it was written in the Jesuit context and with Jesuit colleagues. And that might be also true for some of our Muslim theologians in Paderborn, like that you can see, at least might see it with Muna. You might see it also in Najia Kamshil Yildiz and Tuba Ishik in her way of conceiving Islamic religious education, that they do that in a framework together with colleagues from the Christian side, and we will hear more about that tomorrow. The only person I want to look at a bit closer in that part here is Mona ZeKK, as an Islamic Comparative Theologian. So ZeKK, in her book on Christians, Muslims, and Jesus, is engaged substantially in reading Christian theologians and in learning from them. She wants to come to a greater depth how to talk of God through dialogue. She says that explicitly. Just as Navid Kermani, who is my favorite Muslim comparative theologian avant la lettre, and I have written that already several times, so I won't repeat it here. Just as Kermani, she tries to explore in the very last chapter of that book whether the cross makes any sense for her as a Muslim. She's looking at what I call in my Wittgensteinian approach to comparative theology the regulative, expressive level of religious belief, so how it shapes the daily life of believers. And does this through asking her Christian friends to tell her briefly what they think and feel when they look at a cross or a crucifix. And then in her book, she gives room to that, to explain how the cross works for Christians. She reconstructs step by step why it is so important for Christians as God's self-emptying love. And then she says that he still does not agree with that concept and makes clear that the Quran is silent about that. The interesting point is it's not an apologetic move against it, but she remains silent. So she doesn't say, oh, that's wonderful, I take it, but she also doesn't show how bad it is. She shows the difference. She emphasizes very much God's transcendence, but she also sees what is fascinating for her Christian friends. That's, I think, a very typical comparative theological attitude. And if you read her latest book on human struggle, it's also interesting. She does not use, you might think if a Muslim theologian is writing on human struggle, it's apologetic and tries to explain why jihad is a nice thing. And of course, she's also looking at the great jihad and making clear that this is not war. But when she learns from Christian thinkers like Rilke and Christian theologians like Bonhoeffer, it's quite exciting that this really shapes her theology and changes something. For example, I like that idea of taking that idea of Bonhoeffer's talk of cheap grace and use it to see that Sayyid Qutb is speaking of cheap peace in some sense. I think that's very creative and helps to bring concepts together. Or and then you might suspect, okay, she's using Bonhoeffer to give credit to Sayyid Qutb and bring him out of his dark context. But then it's also interesting that she says that the biggest difference between the two men she's comparing, so Bonhoeffer and Qutb, is that Bonhoeffer's prison letters are full of hope, not anger. So when Bonhoeffer is kept by the Nazis and then killed, he's full of hope, not anger. That's a very Christian thing and very important for people who love Bonhoeffer. And she sees that and writes that. So I think that's also a very comparative theological move because it doesn't have an apologetic agenda behind and still wants to learn from other religious traditions. Okay, so fourth point, Christian philosophical traditions. Of course, a lot could be said here. I just have some bullet points. I just mention, like Muna Tatari again, with learning from the anthropological turn within Kantian philosophy and process theism. I mentioned Ufo Topkara, who learns from Albert Camus to get a better understanding of the virtue ethics of Miskaway. I mentioned Zefzan Öztürk, who learns from Kierkegaard to have a better understanding of Iqbal and using existentialist philosophy for her Muslim thinking. I mention Mojtaba Shabastari, who uses Wittgenstein sometimes to develop his theology, but he also uses Paul Tillich and Karl Rahner and their philosophical backgrounds to develop his theology of revelation. I mention all those Iranian guys around who develop an analytical philosophy of religion and borrow so much from such stupid philosophers like Alvin Plantinga to develop their thinking. I mention Abdul Rahman Mustafa with his take on Wittgenstein to understand Ibn Taymiyyah. I mention Idris with his Idris Nasseri, how he uses Western ethical traditions, tradition of business ethics for Islamic law. And we will hear more from him what else can be done. So, last person I mentioned is Rahim Achar, who develops classical theism in bringing Ibn Sina and Aquinas together. So this is very long, and of course others can be added. But I think it's important to see this, how philosophies who obviously are inspired by Christianity are welcomed even today within Muslim thought, on different continents, from conservative and liberal persons, in very different directions. So I come to my last point. I'm aware that I'm already over the time, so I should keep it short. The forms of learning, which we have here in that emerging field of Islamic comparative theology. My impression is that all 6 forms of learnings which are defined in Catherine Cornill's book on meaning and methods of comparative theology are used. Reaffirmation, so the move that you leave your armchair, go in the other religious traditions, try to learn, and in the end you say, well, it was not very convincing. I'm so happy that I can believe a Muslim. Okay, this exists, and it's okay. It might be difficult sometimes to avoid then supersessionism or the replacement model, but it's a legitimate move in comparative theology to try to learn and to see in the end that you learn that you do not want exactly to learn that one. And of course, I could give examples for that. Of course, also we have the intensification. So the idea that we are happy that the others believe something what we believe as well, and that this is intensified. And you can see that in Abdel Nur and Dag and many others. The other 4 things are the more interesting ones. Recovery, I think this might be the basic task within engaging biblical tradition, within exegesis, because it helps to recover kinds of parts of the Quranic understanding which are not seen at the moment. Reinterpretation might be a central task within the engagement of Christian theologies who can help to use new means of interpretation to frame certain theologies. And appropriation is typically done when other philosophies are used to express your ideas. Of course, this doesn't mean that only in those traditions this is done, but if I wanted to waste more of your time, I could try to give now many examples to all of these points, how this can be done here, but of course you could add other ones. Rectification, as I told you, might be the most complicated thing, and I wonder that, for me, this is the most intriguing and fascinating one. And I only saw it in that reconstruction of the theology of the people of the book in Syria. Catherine Cornill is also only using that in her book in Israel theology. So she says, when we make wrong claims on Jews, Jews have the authority to rectify that and to tell us that this is not correct. In that way, it's also used here in Syria. For me, it would be fascinating to have that more, not only in that subject. This would be real learning from each other. And sometimes I try to give examples for that from the Christian side. But I don't see that yet from a Muslim point of view and would be curious to hear something about that. Okay, so sorry that I took a little bit more than those 45 minutes you gave to me, but nobody will realize it because we started earlier. You can have the feeling that it was just 45 minutes. So thank you for being so patient, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing with you.